Hello, my name's Lizzie. I'm Anglican, and in 2 days' time I'm going to be moving into a convent ready to become a postulant. I've tried over some other videos on this channel to describe how it was that I came to feel that I might be being called to religious life, and I also told the story of like the kind of particular day in which I discovered this community. But another question that I've seen quite a lot on forums or in comments where people are looking at religious life themselves is how do you know that a particular community is the right community for you? Like, if you do feel called to religious life, because there are so many different communities, how do you know that this one is the one that you're being called to? So I just thought I would try and answer try and just describe a few of the things that make me feel that this is the particular community that God's calling me to.
I will hold your people in my heart.
So I've tried to describe how, even from when I was training to be a priest about 10 years ago now, I started developing this kind of growing sense of what kind of formation God wanted me to have, and it I don't know if I can explain it very well in words, but I increasingly felt like that the kind of formation that I read about people receiving in religious life, or the kind of, or not even just formation, that the kind of life that I saw people living in religious life or read about was the kind of life that I felt God calling me to. So that was 10 years ago when the word or the phrase religious life started really resonating with me. But then I did look at a lot of different religious communities and religious orders in this country, and none of them clicked with me. And I read the Anglican Religious Life book cover to cover, and nothing kind of clicked with me. What was a bit more confusing or difficult was I'm kind of two extremes. The very contemplative life really resonates with me, and I personally need a lot of silence in my day and a lot of time, space for personal prayer. And I even looked at being an oblate with a more enclosed kind of order as well, a very contemplative order. So I'm kind of I can be kind of on the very extreme contemplative side of things, but also I can be very active. And I definitely felt called the last few years to like very active kind of urban church ministry, or just urban ministry in general. So it was difficult for me to find I wasn't sure if I was called to a very contemplative one or a very active one, but all the very contemplative ones and all the very active ones I looked at just didn't resonate with me. So in the end, for the last 8 years or so, I just assumed that God was calling me to live like a nun, but on my own in a block of flats in the city centre, and live a life that was this balance between a very contemplative life when I was on my own, and with the way that I spent my evenings and my free time and my weekends and things, and then a very active urban ministry the rest of the time. So that's what I felt called to. And then I described in one of my videos that I called something like the day that I felt called to religious life. In that video I explained how I then got from just assuming that was where God wanted me, or feeling that was where God wanted me, to feeling that actually there was a community that God was now calling me to. And maybe it was right that I was trying to live on my own like a nun for 8 years or so on my own, and then after that period then God was calling me to a community. So I discovered the website and Facebook of this particular religious community that had something about it that when I read about it, that seemed the kind of community that I was called to, that I hadn't found in any other community that I had visited or read about. So that was the initial thing that made me want to investigate more. So then I sent them an email saying, I've got a feeling that I'm being called here, etc., etc. And they said, well, come and be a come and stay as a guest, because like you've never met us and we've never met you, so like the first thing in the procedure is just to come and visit us as a guest. So I stayed in their guest accommodation, and that was my first ever time going to that convent or meeting that community. And even that those first few days, that the feeling I got was like I kept looking at the convent or like the community in general, and I kept thinking that I actually could see myself here, or I've actually got a feeling that God really is calling me here. And then I read a lot more about the community and about the order while I was there. And the more I read about it, the more I felt that this is really, really me. Or it just really resonates with the kind of thing that I felt called to for ages. So kind of in my head, there was this definite, this really kind of resonates with me and what I feel called to. But also deeper down, there was just this sense that this was right, and I actually felt like I had come home after this kind of 12, 15 year discernment journey. But I had a similar thing when before I trained to be a priest, you have to choose which college to train at, which seminary to train at, and so you go and visit a number in person. And then when we used to ask the church, like, how do you know which one is the right one for you to train at, they said you get this kind of sixth sense of one particular one being right. And this is that, I don't know if sixth sense sounds too much like a sci-fi film, but by now I had visited quite a lot of different religious communities, and I had, in the past when I'd visited a convent or a religious community, I'd felt, I've got an affinity with these sisters, I could kind of see myself being a sister myself, but I don't, nothing about this community in particular makes me feel called here. It doesn't kind of click deep within. Whereas this community, the one that I'm moving into to become a postulant, I did get that feeling for the first time after all these years of visiting different religious communities. And then when the superior asked to have a chat with me, and she said how have you found your days here as a guest, like just observing us and getting a feel for the community, I said, well, I actually feel like I've come home after all these years. So that was how I was feeling at the time. And I showed, I haven't got it here, I showed the other day a little booklet someone had bought me. It's a little Roman Catholic red booklet called like Preparing for Religious Life, or Discerning and Preparing for Religious Life. And in that it recommended praying a prayer of obstruction, where you say to God, if this isn't where you want me, please can you kind of obstruct the path to it. So I actually prayed that prayer before I went to speak to the superior. So I was ready for her to say, well, actually we want you to like wait 3 years or join us for a couple of years and try it out. Or I was just waiting, like for various obstructions that might come up, and actually I got the complete opposite of any obstructions. So then I was invited to come and stay with the sisters as an alongside-er, which is when you're kind of living with them, and you're actually living in the sisters' quarters this time rather than in the guest accommodation, and you're joining in their day as much as possible, and they give you things to do, kind of like little duties, to try and like fill your day up a bit and give you the sense of what it's like living in this community. So I did that for the length of time that they specified, and I was open to that making me feel this really isn't right for me, or I was just like open to whatever sense that period might bring up for me. And it didn't put me off or anything, and it didn't make me feel any less that this was where I was called to. It did highlight to me some of the things that I would struggle with, but I guess that's part of the alongside of time, that it helps you become more aware of the things that you will struggle with, because of course there's going to be things that you struggle with, but nothing the whole time I was there as an alongside-er, like living with them, nothing took away this sense that God was calling me here, and something being really right about it. And I started almost seeing like the sisters as potential future family, and it kind of felt like home. And the time, this was I can't remember how many months ago this was now, but at the time, basically, this community really felt like this is my home now. So that's the best I can do in describing the kinds of things that made me feel that this particular community, it was where God was calling me to, or might be calling me to.